some of the Jews had formed they'd come together, about 40 of them, and they had devised this plot whereby they were going to kill Paul. And we have just seen that theme over and over again on our journeys, where they wanted to kill him. They didn't like what it is that he had to say. They were not receptive to what the scriptures really did say. And so their answer to all of that was just to kill him. So his nephew had come, and we discussed all about that, how surprised we were to learn of a nephew, of a sister, of any family. But we talked about that in detail. The nephew had revealed to Paul this plot, and Paul had sent him or asked one of the centurions to take him to the commander to provide this information to the commander. So that's just like a quick update to where we got at this point. So when the commander learned about this plot, because Paul's nephew told him, the commander decided that he needed to send Paul away from Jerusalem. He needed to send him to Caesarea, which was going to be the next Roman outpost, I guess, where he could send him. And there was a governor there. Governor Felix was there. So that was what his plan was. He had ordered the soldiers. We talked about that last week. He had ordered 200 soldiers, regular soldiers, and 200 spearmen. And we talked about the distinction with them. We talked about the armor that the regular soldiers have, and that the spearmen were more lightly armed, so that they could, say, have their weapon, their javelin, in one arm, and the other arm would be free for them to apprehend someone. So in addition to those, so 200 regular soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 70 horsemen. So the commander was like just arming all around Paul, just so many to escort him up to Caesarea. And we talked about that, why he was doing that and so forth. And then he wrote a letter to the governor, Governor Felix, I guess as his means of explanation, because we talked about the fact that the commander wasn't going. He was sending Paul, he was sending all these troops. He was not going there in person himself. And so he wanted to color this situation a certain way. He wanted to portray what had happened as he would like it to be believed, not necessarily as it was so. And so last week we talked about that we were going to actually fact check his letters, or letter, I should say, because the things that he says are not necessarily really what took place. So that was where we left off, and his letter begins in Acts chapter 23. The beginning part of it is actually verse 26, Claudius Lysias, and we talked about that we now have his name. We know what his name is. We didn't previously have that. He was just the commander. Now we know he's Commander Claudius Lysias, and that he addressed the letter to His Excellency, Governor Felix. And we talked about how that was the expected means of addressing someone of the stature of a governor in Roman protocol. And we talked about that, and just the form of the letter was the standard protocol that would be used for Roman correspondence. And then he offered his greetings. And before we actually talked about the letter, we spent a little time last week, and we talked about what we knew about the commander up until this point. And we talked about how he had immediately responded to the initial disturbance. And that is in such contrast to now something we would think of an even more important nature, sending someone to the governor, sending all these troops and a prisoner to the governor, and you're not even going to go. but he went in person immediately at the initial disturbance. We talked about his pattern of acting first and asking questions later. We cited the examples of him doing that. And then we also talked about how easily he was distracted, how it was all about him. Whatever might be coming up, he was going to make it about him. When he realized that Paul spoke Greek, he automatically made a determination in his mind, the commander's mind, of who Paul was, meaning the Egyptian. And we spoke about all that last week. But what I wanted to do this week, before we actually get into the rest of the letter and get into our fact checking, I thought that we should look at who he is addressing this to. So we're going to look just for a few minutes at Governor Felix. Governor Felix, as I mentioned last week, is quite an interesting character. And he's going to be with us for the next couple chapters. So we really need to get an understanding about him, where he's coming from, in order to understand some things. Some of the things that you'll see in the next coming chapters will make no sense. But then, what a surprise, right? Some of the things that we've already seen haven't made any sense. But Governor Felix, let's just talk about who he is. And actually, before we can discuss Governor Felix and who he is, we need to talk just a little about the Emperor Claudius, who was the emperor in power at that time. Now, that name is familiar to you because it's come up as we've been through these journeys. And not the first time that we heard his name come up, but probably the one that stuck in our mind the most was during the second missionary journey when Paul was in Corinth, and that was over in Acts chapter 18, verse 2. And we're not going to turn there, but the thing that stands out there, you recall, that was when he met Priscilla and Aquila. And we've seen how important they were to his ministry. Not just Paul's ministry, but to the ministry of all of the converts in that area, both in Corinth and also in Ephesus. And what was noteworthy there was the fact that they were now, or they were at that time in Corinth because Claudius had expelled all of the Jews from Rome. You recall now, we talked about that in pretty good detail, about why it was that Claudius had expelled all the Jews, because of the disputes between the Christians and the Jews there in Rome. So Priscilla and Aquila had to leave Rome, as did all the other Jews, and they ended up in Corinth, which is where Paul met them. And that was such an important part of Paul's ministry there, because you recall how much of a difficult time he had between Athens and Corinth, that part of the journey, because you recall he was alone for a good part. Silas and Timothy and Luke weren't with him. But Claudius was the emperor during this time. For quite a few years, he really served as emperor of Rome. Now, Claudius was born into what we might consider as Roman royalty. In his family line, there was Mark Antony and Julius Caesar in his lineage. So he was kind of born into this little bit of Roman royalty. But his father died unexpectedly when Claudius was 9. And he and 2 other siblings were raised by his mother, Antonia, and she never remarried. Now, the thing that becomes interesting here is that as a child, Claudius was sickly, and he was afflicted with a limp, and he had some deafness. So they don't know. Part of it, as I read through the different historical accounts, I think that it may have been a cerebral palsy. They don't quite know. But his mother, this was not, it's like this was not what she wanted in her child. you know, he wasn't perfect, right? So she referred to him, listen to this, as a monster. And she used him as a standard for stupidity. Oh my goodness. This is his mother. And in fact, for a portion of his life as he was growing up, she kind of shipped him off to live with his grandmother for a while. But because he was sort of like a social reject to the rest of the family, and let me just interject, as he got older, he kind of grew out of some of the problems that he was having, some of the deafness and the limping. He kind of grew out of that as he got older. And he really became quite a scholar, which is something that set him apart. But anyway, because he was treated as a social outcast or as a reject by most of the family, he then actually formed his friendships and relationships with the slaves and the freedmen of the imperial family. They became his friends because those of what should have been his status didn't want anything to do with him. Now, two of the slaves, who Antonia, Claudius's mother's name Antonia, she actually granted freedom to two that are noteworthy here. And one was named Pallas, Pallas, and then his younger brother, Felix. Governor Felix, that's who we're talking to today. So I needed to give you this, this background because the emperor comes into play not just now, but continuing on with Paul. The emperor is going to be in play, but also Felix and his brother Pallas. Now, Pallas was a favorite of Claudius. It's like they were fast friends as children. And that continued for a long time, even after adulthood and after Claudius became emperor. When he became the emperor, Pallas was like his aide de camp. He had a really high level. He had Claudius's ear. That's probably the best way to put it. So that if Claudius was going to do something, he might run it by Pallas, and whatever Pallas said was pretty much what he was going to do. Now, Felix was what we might consider the spoiled child, the little baby spoiled child who continually got into trouble and was saved by consequences, not just in childhood, but throughout his life by his brother Pallas. For whatever reason, we don't know. But Pallas would always bail Felix out, give him a pass, put in a good word for him, no matter what Felix did. And this did not change Felix's behavior. It's not like he felt, oh, Pallas really went out on a limb for me, and so, I need to clean up my act, I need to do better. No, he was a spoiled brat, and his expectation is that he could do anything he wanted to do, and it would be all right, because if nothing else, if he couldn't talk his way out of it, and he was kind of a smooth talker, especially his way with the women, but if he couldn't talk his way out of it, then his big brother Pallas was going to get him out of it. So that's the background. Now, Pallas convinced Claudius, remember Claudius is the emperor now, he convinced Claudius to make Felix the governor of this area, Judea, which would include Caesarea, Samaria, and Jerusalem, and that whole area there. And that he was not initially given that whole area, but that's a different story of how he acquired the rest of it. But you get the picture. You know it was by deception and deceit and whatever else, it took. But that's how he got it. So he was the governor at the time. And Felix was known for his cruelty. His administration was plagued with corruption, bribery, riots. The people hated him, plain and simple. Now he did suppress. There were like robbers and murderers. If you traveled along a road, if you went from one city to another, let me put it that way, the chances of you getting robbed were pretty good. So he did suppress some of those robbers and the murderers in the area. He kind of handled that. But he would then, in turn, maybe use some of them for his own gain. Now, Felix is the particular person, you recall the commander, our friend Claudius Lycia, the commander, asked Paul if he was that Egyptian. Recall that we had that conversation, and that's back in Acts chapter 21, verse 38. This was at the point that Paul spoke to the commander in Greek, and he said, because he wanted to address the crowd. And the commander, surprised, you speak Greek, and aren't you that Egyptian? And you recall we talked about that. Because the Egyptian had with him assassins, and these were the kind of people that sort of had little small daggers that they hid under their clothing, and they would go around in broad daylight in a crowd and just stab people and kill them right then. So Felix was the one that took care of that Egyptian. However, some of the other assassins came to work for him, because he would have people assassinated if they didn't serve his purpose. Even the high priest, some of the high priests, this one Jonathan, a high priest Jonathan, he had assassinated. So that's who Felix was. And in fact, his heavy-handedness, his cruelty, his lust, all the things that he was, caused such unrest in the area. Caused the people, they already hated him, but there were uprisings and revolts and so forth. So much so that the next emperor, because Claudius had passed away, but the next emperor, Nero, actually recalled Felix to Rome. He was called out, sent back to Rome to actually stand trial, because the complaints against him had just made their way all the way up to the emperor. And Big Brother Pallas was right there again. I guess he had Nero's ear, maybe not as much as he had Claudius's ear, but he still had influence. And even though Felix stood trial and was found guilty, the normal penalty if someone was found guilty for the level of crimes that he was found guilty of was going to be death. But Pallas got that wiped out. So Felix just, I guess, went on his merry way. We don't really hear much about him, but he was not executed, even though he was found guilty, even though he had caused revolts and uprising and all manner of things, with his bribery and his cruelty and everything else that took place under his administration. So that is who Paul is being sent to. Now, the commander really did not have a choice as to who the governor was, because the governor was Felix. That was who the governor was. He had to send Paul up. So as we fact-check his letter, part of me wanted to think, and there's no basis for this, but I don't know if he was coloring the letter in a certain way because he knew how Felix was, the type of man Felix was. But I really think he was just covering himself, trying to make his situation look better than it actually was, as he was dispatching all these soldiers and this prisoner up to Caesarea. Okay, so now we're going to look at the main body of the letter as we do our fact checking. Okay, verse 27, and I'll be reading out of the NIV. So, this is Claudius Lysias, the commander, writing to Felix. Verse 27, he says, "This man," talking about Paul, "was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him." Listen to this. "For I had learned that he is a Roman citizen." Lying right off the bat. The first sentence is a lie. All right, I'll try to contain myself as we go through this. Now, we know that that is not hardly the order of things. So, he did not learn about Paul's Roman citizenship until Acts 22, verse 26. Let's just go over there for a moment. Because in order to check the facts, we need to look at the facts, right? So, actually, I'm going to let's see. I'm going to start here as at verse 25. We'll be coming back as we go through his letter. It's going to take us back to this body of scripture here because the commander says different things in different orders, not necessarily as they happen. But let's look at verse 25. It says, "As they stretched him out to flog him," or to scourge him. So you remember we talked about this at length. They had to scourge someone, they would put them in a certain position where they were leaning forward. They were like their back was inclined so that it was going to be exposed and stretched tight. They were kind of wrapped around a big post or something, and their back was angled and exposed so that when the scourge hit them, and you remember what that looked like, all those extra spikes in it, it would really dig into the flesh and tear flesh, sinew, blood, everything. So that's the position Paul was in. So verse 25 says, "As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, 'Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?'" That is the first revelation of Paul being a Roman citizen that we see here. Now, verse 26 says, "When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. 'What are you going to do?' he asked. 'This man is a Roman citizen.'" So it is at that point that the commander, our dear friend Claudius Lysias, learns that Paul's a Roman citizen. Not, as he's saying here in our text in 23, verse 27, he leads the Felix, or the reader, whoever it's going to be, in this case Governor Felix, to believe that he went and rescued Paul from the Jews who had seized him right there at the temple, because he had learned that Paul was a Roman citizen. So, he lied right off the bat, and we've looked at what the actual reality is, the fact. All right, so then we go to the next verse, verse 28. And he says, "I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin." Lie number 2. This is another lie. That was not the order of things. Now, he did not think of taking him to the Sanhedrin until after the incident of learning his citizenship. So let's go back over there, Acts 22, and this time we're going to go at verse 24. So a little bit before, as I mentioned, it comes out a little out of order. Paul was attempting to speak to the crowd at the steps of the Antonia barracks. That's where this is. long before the Sanhedrin scene. I guess you say there's so many different scenes and so much violence and things going on, you forget which scene is which. But this is before that. Not as it would appear, as Lysias would like you to think, or like Felix to think at a different time. But in verse 24, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. So his first attempt to find out why Paul was being accused and the people were reacting was when he was going to flog him. Remember, that's another case of the act first and ask questions later. Now, of course, he's not letting Felix know that. All right, so verse 28 is another lie, or if someone wants to give him a little half credit and not full truth. Isn't that a lie? If the timing is wrong, if it didn't happen when you're saying it happened, that's still a lie. Okay, so we go back over now to Acts 23, verse 29. And he says, I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. This is, I guess I'm going to give him a pass on this statement, because the Pharisees were saying, we find no fault in him. Paul had made a statement that I'm on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. So from the commander's perspective, he would interpret that, and we have to assume at this point that the Sanhedrin was conducted in Greek because the commander was able to understand it. He can say, based on what he heard, even though it was about to devolve down into a turmoil and near riot right inside the Sanhedrin, that it dealt with something in their law. He probably didn't have a really good understanding about what the hope of the resurrection was. And then with the Pharisees saying, we find no fault with this man because they do believe in that, and they're saying maybe an angel or a spirit had spoken to Paul. So the commander's probably sitting there like, what? What are you saying? What is this? And he probably was not paying as much attention to what they were saying as to the ramping up of the level of tension. You saw it, because we saw it building from the point, everyone's supposed to be seated. We saw it building up to when the Pharisees stood up. So we knew it was about to go down now. They're standing up, and then they're beginning to hurl insults one to another over. And the fact that he had to remove Paul because he was afraid of the violence that they might tear him apart is an indication of how bad that was going. So he doesn't say anything at all about any of that, but he makes this determination that whatever the problem was, it had to do with their law, meaning the law, the Jews' law, and not any Roman law. So if it was not going to be something against a Roman law, only the Roman law could actually someone could only be sentenced to death by the Romans. The Jews did not have that power. They could not sentence anyone to death. And in order for them to be sentenced to death, it had to transgress some type of a Roman law. If it was only a transgression against the Jewish law, they didn't have anything to do with that. So the Jews were limited, and we talked about that before, in the type of punishment that they could get or that they could mete out. And they certainly had no right to execute anyone. And especially in this case, now that the commander knows that Paul's a Roman citizen. So that amped it up even yet another level. So then, that's verse 29. So we gave him a little bit of a pass. So lied in verse 27, lied in verse 28. We give him a pass in verse 29. When we get to verse 30, he says, when I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. He almost made it through this verse. It is true that as soon as he learned about the plot, as soon as he got that word from Paul's nephew, he did spring right into action and arrange for Paul to be sent there. But he had not ordered the accusers to present their case against Felix. He hadn't done that, not at that point. And in fact, we never get to see that. I'm assuming, we have to assume that he did it at some point after Paul was on his way. So that's our fact checking on the letter here. And as we look at the whole thing as a whole, we see that from the commander's perspective, which is true, he could not hardly say what had really gone down, because he probably would have been recalled immediately. Remember, that was kind of like a little cushy job he had there, right there at the temple. The fortress, the Antonia fortress, was there at the temple, and that was their charge. And he could have been consigned to go be in a desert or something. You know, that'll be your that'll be your area to handle troops out in the desert. So he was really looking out for himself and to keep his job there. And even separate from that, he would have to answer. He needed to be able to report back why there was a riot. These things were not supposed to take place. The whole reason that the Romans were there were to keep the peace in the area. Remember, the Romans wanted to go into all these places and they wanted to get out of the places whatever they had, all their goods. They wanted to export them. They wanted to get, probably in that area, all that wonderful olive oil and all the things that were there. They wanted to, as best they could, keep the peace. They would allow the people in most of the places some amount of self-government, if that would sort of keep them happy, so that they could get their taxes out and all their goods and trade could go through. That's what the Romans wanted. So for the commander to have had a riot go down on his watch and not be able to explain why, that was a serious, serious problem. And it became even more complicated as he learned that Paul was a Roman citizen. So he was really covering himself in this letter, making it sound like he was the good commander carrying out his duties. But the question is going to kind of hang in the air as to why he didn't go. We'll see that come up just as a little aside in the next chapter. But he could not go. You've seen people who've been put on the spot. When you're lying and you get caught in a lie, you got to tell another lie, and it can be an uncomfortable position. So he didn't want to be put on the spot or questioned in any way about, well, what do you mean, and well, what happened then, and so forth. So it was better for him to send this whole entourage, and he really did at this point in time want to get Paul out of his hair. Get this man away from Jerusalem, away from me, because I don't know what the problem is with these Jews and this man, but get him away. So that's it. Then we go down now to verse 31. So probably the centurion, one of them probably was the charge person, and he carried the letter. So verse 31 says, so the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. Now you remember they were told to leave them at 9 o'clock. Some of the translations may say the third hour of the night, because the commander wanted as much distance between Paul and his troops and the Jews as he could possibly get. They were still, this was 400 foot soldiers. There were 70 on horseback, but all these foot soldiers were going to travel the distance. Now, as we talked last week, Caesarea was a good 70, 80 miles from Jerusalem. And so they went as far as they could during the night. They went to Antipatris. And this was a military post that was built by Herod the Great. What a surprise there, right? We see Herod building all over the place, everything. Build, build, build. That was his legacy. But he had built this port, and it was going to be a place where the military could have a detachment that was going to stay there. It was about halfway, roughly, between Jerusalem and Caesarea. But it was now beyond the point of a heavy Jewish population. So the area in Jerusalem, Judea, that area down there, Samaria, so forth, was heavily populated and controlled by the Jews. As you start up that peninsula further north, and you get to, in this case, Antipatris and then Caesarea and some of the cities up, they become more Gentile dominated. We spoke about that a little bit last week. Because you recall when Paul was coming on his way to Jerusalem, and after the ship docked at Tyre and they started coming down, they stopped at Caesarea and stayed for 4 days with Philip, the evangelist, and his daughter. So it was a very Gentile and in many cases Christian area. So the danger of the Jews doing something to Paul was lessened. And so when they get to Antipatris, they stop there. And then, because I can imagine, this is like, say, maybe about 30 miles or so. And they had just been going at quite a speed. And now the Roman soldiers were equipped to do this. This was part of their training, even on foot, that they would have to travel. And Paul was riding. We saw that he had a horse, and there were 70 horsemen. But there was still a pretty good pace that they had traveled. So by the time they get there, everybody probably needed to stop and rest a little bit. So verse 32 says, the next day, so they overnighted, or let me put it this way. They left at 9 p.m. We don't know exactly what time they got to Antipatris, like maybe in the middle of the night sometime before daybreak the next day. So verse 32 says, the next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. So all of the foot soldiers, both the 200 regular soldiers and the 200 spearmen, went back now to Jerusalem. They had made a determination, okay, he is out of imminent danger. There aren't any Jews in this area, or there were going to be so few that the 70 remaining, which is not a small number either, 70, and they were on horseback with Paul, so that they could, easily get away from anybody on foot. So at this point, they went on, or sent the horsemen on, and the troops, the regular 200 troops, and the spearmen 200 troops went back to Jerusalem. Okay. Verse 33. So when the cavalry, or some of your translations may say when the horsemen, but when the cavalry arrived at Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. And I guess then they came on back to Jerusalem. And if they're on horseback, they definitely would be able to get back to Antipatris, or I doubt that they would try to make it all the way back to Jerusalem in one day. But nevertheless, they delivered Paul safely and the letter. That was their responsibility, that was their charge, and they did it. So verse 34 It says, the governor read the letter and asked what province he was from, he meaning Paul. Learning that he was from Cilicia, verse 35, he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Remember, because that Claudius Lysias had said that in the letter that they were coming. He ordered Paul to be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So, in the Roman Empire, it depended on where you were, what city it was, what province, under what jurisdiction it came. So some of the provinces came under the control of the Roman Senate, and others reported directly to the emperor. So it turns out Cilicia and some others were considered imperial provinces. They actually fell under the jurisdiction of the emperor, and so therefore Governor Felix, who was a local person, would hear the case. If it had fallen under another jurisdiction, he would have Paul sent to another place. So, say for instance, if it was like in Samaria, it fell under that jurisdiction, then he would have to send him to that place under another governor to handle it. But in this case, because Paul was from Cilicia, and I just found that just so interesting, because they're going to have a trial based on the birthplace of the person. You know, isn't that interesting? As opposed to having the trial wherever the offense occurred or whatever. But that was how they did it at that time. So that's where we leave off with it. Verse 35, because it was really kind of like a continuation of verse 34. He says, I will hear your case when your accusers get here, because that's what Claudius Lysias had told him. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Now, several weeks ago, I had asked you, and I forgot to remind you last week, but I had told you that I had placed a couple images on our Wednesday page of the website. And one of the images was like an aerial view of Herod's palace. So I'm going to come in, although I think you can get it up on the screen, but I'm going to come in so that I can point out a couple things to you. This is one of them. The other image that I had asked you to download was another one that was Herod's palace at Caesarea. And we'll talk a little bit more about this one probably next week. But I wanted to go over this conceptual aerial view because it gives the idea of part of the city. We talked last week about how Herod had built Caesarea and all that was there. So I just wanted to show a little bit. So we're going to try this to come in. Let's see. Okay. The palace itself is this. It juts out on this promontory here, and that we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail next week, because it was quite the place. I know you're not surprised at that, because we have seen the things that Herod has built, some of them, and he did not cut any corners. There was nothing too big. If he was going to drain a swamp or bring in water, fresh water, beyond the salt water and all these other things that he did, it's no surprise. But we can see here that in addition to this, he has here, this is like an amphitheater. Here we have like a stadium. We can see parts of the harbor. I think it goes up in this area and beyond, because you recall he built this harbor and 600 ships could actually come in there. But it was very, very expansive, and you can get to see some of all of the were a conceptual view of what some of the detail might have looked like. So there was going to be big structures, but also beauty. He's going to have trees and flowers and so forth coming in there. It was quite the place at the time. Okay? After Herod died, his palace actually became the residence of the, I don't know what that beeping is. It's not in here, but it sounds like it. His palace became the residence of the Roman governors in that area. So if there was a Roman governor who was stationed at Caesarea, like Felix was, and Festus, who's going to be coming after him, they lived in the palace. So I'm going to stop here because I really want to talk about what the palace itself was like, what this particular image was. I want to go into that so we can get an idea of what Paul was, how he was going to be confined, because as we'll find out, he's going to end up being there for a couple years. So I'm going to stop there. We do have some prayer requests and some praise reports. Praise God for the praise reports. And some other announcements to make. So again, thank you for being with us today, for being on our live stream of our Bible study in the book of Acts, every Wednesday at 11 a.m. And just to remind you that we also live stream our Bible study on Tuesdays. That's in the book of Psalms, also at 11 a.m. And that's facilitated by our interim pastor, Reverend Sheila Thorpe. And also our worship services on Sunday at 9 a.m. are live streamed. But we are inviting you, everyone, we invite you to come and join us for in-person worship. There is a registration form on our website that you do need to complete. You can complete it right online and submit it because we still are under space constraints. But for the most part, those of you who would like to come and you just be masked up and all of the protocols that are applied, the social distancing, are in effect. But we invite you to join us for in-person worship at our facility, 515 West 4th Street in Plainfield, New Jersey. Okay? Also, our education arm, SIBL, Shiloh Institute of Biblical Learning and Education, is beginning a new semester of classes. Well, October is tomorrow, so I should go on and say this month, but beginning these classes in October. So on our website, you'll find a letter from Reverend Thorpe about SIBL, and she's explaining several things about it, because we're going to begin the classes initially just on a Zoom platform, so that people can either attend the class by video or by phone, by conference call, but everyone is able to attend a class. We also have the list of our classes, and we have a registration form. The registration form is not a form that you can complete online. You would have to download it and print it. But the easiest thing to do is to look through the classes, decide what class you want to attend, and just to call our church office and tell them, give them your name, your phone number, your email, that you want to be in that particular class. And someone will get back to you to confirm it for you on that one. So those are our SIBL classes. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about voting, because it is just ever so important. So we are doing everything we can to help you out, especially if you are in New Jersey. So if you're in New Jersey, last week you should have received your ballot in the mail. probably towards the middle or end of last week, but everybody was sent, every registered voter, let me put it that way, was sent the actual official ballot in the mail. And you have your ballot, and then you have options of what you can do. You can, of course, complete your ballot. You can mail it in, regular U.S. mail. You can put it in a secure drop box. And what we've done on our website is we have a link that says secure Dropbox location. So if you're in New Jersey and you click that link, it will take you to a page and listed by the counties. You can click on your county and it will give you a list of the secure drop boxes, and you will find one in your area. Many of our towns in our area here, Plainfield, Piscataway, South Plainfield, Middlesex, do have a secure Dropbox location right in their town. So for the most part, you don't have to go far. Now, and this is only Charlotte speaking, I think the most important thing is that you do vote. I would say that you vote early, and that my recommendation is to use a secure Dropbox. Because if you have any questions or qualms about all the controversy of the U.S. mail, use a secure Dropbox. That's their whole function in life, is for the ballots. Now, we have the ability in the state of New Jersey now to be able to track our ballot. So that once you get your ballot, you are able then to register and to create like an account that will allow you to track your ballot. Now, there are a couple things that you need to do for that. So again, we've provided the links on our website to make it easy. So you can just go to our website, click these buttons, and it will take you to the pages to do what you need to do. So in order to track your ballot, you have to create an account. And in order to create the account, you're going to need your voter ID number. So there's a link on the website that says find your voter ID. And it just takes you to a page, a little bit of information you put in, and it will come up and it will give you your voter ID number. With that number, then you can click the button that says track your ballot, and you create an account on that page, because it's going to need that voter ID number. And as you're creating this account, you're going to create a username, password, the things that are typical for any kind of online account. And then you will be able to go back to that in the future and track your ballot. See where it is. Make sure that you know it was delivered, that it was counted, and so forth. I think that is just an outstanding, wonderful thing. And that is the case. You can create that account no matter how you vote, whether you put it in the U.S. mail, whether you use a secure Dropbox, whether you go in person to vote. Whatever it is that you do, you will be able to track your ballot. So if you are not registered, or if you know someone who is not registered, the deadline is fast approaching, October 13th. So please, everybody, it's just more important from my perspective than ever to be able to vote this year. It is your right as a citizen of the United States, and you need to exercise it. Okay? So on our prayer requests, well, let me give you the praise reports first. It's exciting to have praise reports. Last week I mentioned to you that Yvonne Watts was going to have knee replacement surgery. She did have her surgery yesterday, and her surgery went well, and she just wants to thank everyone for praying for her up until this point. And she's asking that you continue to pray for her as she goes through the recovery period. I know from firsthand experience it's a long process requiring physical therapy and so forth, but she's on her way having the replacement done. So keep her in your prayers. Also, I wanted to give an update on Carol Howell. You recall several weeks ago, it was, in fact, maybe even more than a month now, certainly more than a month, that Carol had broken her ankle. We had discussed that, and we've kind of given her progress reports as we've gone on. So I was in correspondence with her yesterday, and She has begun physical therapy. And you remember I told you she had a boot on that went all the way up to her knee. Well, she is hoping that the boot will be removed shortly, like maybe in the next couple of days. And that then she will get to go to a special sneaker. Uh, I'm sure she's going to send me a picture. I can't wait to see what the special sneaker is going to look like. But she is walking. She's walking pretty well with her cane, and she's beginning to put a little weight on her foot. So she is so grateful for your prayers, and she asks that you just continue to pray for her because she's at a different point now that she's beginning the physical therapy, putting weight on her foot, and getting back to more of a normal lifestyle with it. So keep her in your prayers. We want you to keep in prayer Pat Fields. We want to keep in prayer all of the sick and shut-in of our ministry, whether we have their names or not. So you just keep them in your prayers. We want to pray for the leadership of the Shiloh Baptist Church, for our pulpit search team, and certainly as we are still affected by this COVID-19 with so many millions of cases and so many hundreds of thousands of people who have passed away in our country alone. Please keep that in your prayer, the whole situations. We've seen the back and forth with the schools, some of them trying to start in person, only to have an uptick in their an outbreak, I should say, and to have to close down. We've seen it with the sports, where they're trying to have the sports and the problems that that's caused. But so just keep that whole situation in your prayers, because we are not hardly through with this. Not hardly. But those are our prayer requests for today. Again, thank you so much for being with us, and let's just go to the Lord in prayer. Father God, in the name of your precious Son, Jesus, we thank you for this time that we've had. We're so grateful, Lord, for all the blessings that you've given us, for all the insights and knowledge that we have gained as we go through this study of the book of Acts. Lord, we're seeing so much. We see corruption and bribery and all the things that took place then, and my Lord, they're taking place now. So we are asking you to provide us with the wisdom that the Apostle Paul displayed, so we can understand how we need to handle it for ourselves. Lord, thank you for this time. We ask that you be with all of those, the names that we've called, and for the names that we don't even have. Guide us and keep us all, bring us back safely for our next Bible study and for worship on Sunday. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.